Welcome to the deep dive. I am absolutely thrilled you are joining us today. We spend our lives interacting with the built environment around us without really seeing it, right?
Right, yeah.
We walk into coffee shops, we drive past these sprawling new suburban developments on our morning commute, and we buy groceries that were grown on vast, highly mechanized farms. But, and this is the core of it, how often do you stop and think about the invisible frameworks holding all of that together?
Most people never do. I mean, why would you?
Exactly. So today, our mission is to decode the massive hidden gears that turn our physical world. We are looking at a really dense, comprehensive set of real estate and legal guidelines. We're getting into the intense, high-stakes legal and financial rule books behind commercial leases, massive land development projects, and this is wild, multi-million-dollar agricultural properties.
It is a completely different universe from what most of us are used to.
Yeah.
Like when we look at residential real estate, buying a house or renting an apartment, so much of that transaction is fundamentally driven by emotion.
Right. It's about the feeling.
Exactly. It is about how the natural light hits the kitchen counter in the morning or, the general feeling of safety in the neighborhood. But the backdrop we are exploring today, which is essentially a mix of commercial blueprints, shifting cityscapes, and rolling farmland that is governed by cold, hard, and frankly fascinating math and liability.
Math and liability, the fun stuff.
It really is, though. It is entirely about risk mitigation, environmental compliance, and extremely specific contractual obligations.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the material we are working through today is, well, it's dense. And honestly, for you listening right now, this matters because every single store you shop in, every new subdivision you drive past, and quite literally the food on your table is governed by these exact rules.
That's the reality.
Even if you're familiar with commercial real estate, the sheer volume of paperwork required before a single key is handed over is staggering. I want to start by looking at the commercial lease, because I think there's this misconception that renting a commercial storefront is just, I don't know, like renting a bigger, more expensive apartment.
No, not even close.
Right. Looking at the framework here, the paperwork evolution alone is wild.
Wild is absolutely the right word. In the commercial realm, the paperwork goes through a very specific evolutionary process, and each stage has a totally different level of legal weight.
Okay.
It is not just signing a standard form and handing over a deposit. It almost always starts with a letter of intent. Now, a letter of intent is, well, it's exactly what it sounds like.
A statement of intent.
Right. It is a preliminary written agreement. It establishes the basic provisions, the covenants, and the terms the parties eventually want to include in a detailed agreement. But the key takeaway for anyone entering this space is that it is simply a statement of general understanding.
So it's not binding.
No, it does not have the legal teeth, the granular details, or the enforceable clauses that you would find in the final lease.
So if it doesn't have legal teeth, why do sophisticated business people even bother with it? I mean, why not just go straight to the main contract?
Because drafting a massive, highly customized commercial lease is incredibly expensive.
The lawyer fees.
Exactly. You are involving high-priced commercial real estate lawyers on both sides. Before anyone starts billing hundreds of dollars an hour to draft a 60-page document, the landlord and the prospective tenant need to know they are at least in the same ballpark.
That makes sense.
The letter of intent is essentially a very formal vibe check. It allows a corporate board to look at the broad strokes, like the proposed rent, the square footage, the lease term, and give a green light to proceed with the actual legal negotiations.
That's a great way to put it. It's the rough sketch before you commission the oil painting. But then we move from that letter of intent to the next stage, which is the agreement to lease. And reading through the legal guidelines, I sort of picture the agreement to lease as the skeleton, whereas the final formal lease is the customized, legally binding muscle on top of it.
That is a brilliant analogy, yes. The agreement to lease sets out the fundamental material aspects of the deal.
The bare bones.
The bare bones. It is an unsettled form of a lease, but it includes the absolute essential elements. So the exact legal names of the landlord and tenant, the precise description of the premises, the exact amount of rent, and the basic terms.
Got it.
It also has to include specific exceptions, reservations, covenants, and any specific conditions. The idea is to lock in all the major deal breakers so that the landlord's lawyer can then take this skeleton and use it to draft the final lease. But, and this is a fascinating quirk in standard industry practice, real estate salespersons will routinely attach a completely blank standard lease form to this agreement to lease.
Okay, I saw that in the notes, and it genuinely confused me at first. Why on earth are they attaching 50 pages of blank paper to a legal agreement?
It seems totally counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But it is actually a vital protective measure. They attach that blank standard lease so the prospective tenant can take it to their own lawyer and review the landlord's standard boilerplate clauses before anything is actually set in stone.
Oh, because the standard clauses are usually terrible for the tenant.
Precisely.
Oh.
Commercial leases are notoriously one-sided in favor of the landlord. By attaching the blank form, the tenant's lawyer can say, okay, we agree on the rent amount in the agreement to lease, but looking at your standard blank lease, I see a clause here that says we are responsible for roof repairs. We are not agreeing to that.
Ah.
It allows the tenant to negotiate the fine print before the customized formal lease is even drafted.
So it saves time and money on revisions. And then once all that back and forth is done, we finally arrive at the formal lease itself. This is the highly customized contract prepared by the landlord's lawyer. And it includes all those unique negotiated clauses specific to the type and condition of that exact property. And once all parties sign that formal lease, that is the legally binding muscle.
Exactly. And once those documents are signed, the immediate next question for the landlord becomes, who is actually on the hook if things go wrong?
Right.
Commercial landlords are inherently risk-averse. They are essentially lending you a multi-million-dollar asset. So if a tenant is a relatively new business or a shell corporation, the landlord typically requires the tenant to bring in some financial bodyguards.
I like that, financial bodyguards. And the guidelines outline 3 distinct types of protection here: a guarantor, an indemnifier, or a co-tenant. And the legal distinctions between them are massive.
Okay.
This is a part of the framework that completely blew my mind. Okay, I'm looking at this note about guarantors versus indemnifiers, and I was a bit confused initially. It looks like one of them basically gets off scot-free if the business goes bankrupt.
That is exactly right, and it is a nuance that has cost many landlords a lot of money.
Okay, break this down for us.
Let's look at the guarantor first. The guarantee provided by a guarantor is legally limited. It only extends up to the obligations of the tenant. A guarantor is essentially saying to the landlord, I promise that the tenant will fulfill their obligations, and if they don't, I will.
Seems reasonable.
It does. But here is the critical flaw. If your business totally fails and you legally file for bankruptcy or insolvency, the law often steps in and extinguishes the tenant's future lease obligations.
Because the bankrupt entity no longer legally exists or
Right.
is legally protected from those debts.
Precisely. And mathematically, if the tenant's obligations are legally reduced to zero by a bankruptcy court,
Oh, I see where this is going.
and the guarantor only guaranteed the tenant's obligations,
The guarantor's obligations also drop to 0.
they are off the hook. The invisible legal tether is cut.
Which is terrifying for a landlord. You think you have a rich uncle backing up the startup goes bankrupt, and the rich uncle just gets to walk away smiling.
Which is precisely why landlords with good lawyers vastly prefer an indemnifier.
The heavyweight.
The absolute heavyweight. The scope of liability for an indemnifier is fundamentally different from a guarantor. An indemnifier is not just promising that the tenant will pay. They are making an independent, primary promise directly to the landlord to cover any losses.
So it's a separate contract entirely.
Effectively, yes. Their obligations remain firmly intact even if the tenant files for bankruptcy or insolvency. The indemnity agreement is absolute and unconditional. It usually states that it can only be terminated by mutual written agreement between the landlord and the indemnifier.
Wow.
It is an incredible amount of risk for someone to take on, but landlords demand it because it is virtually bulletproof.
And then the third option is the co-tenant, which seems a bit more straightforward. If a proposed guarantor or indemnifier decides they want more control, they might just become a co-tenant.
Right. Both individuals or corporations become equally responsible for the lease obligations from day one.
So if one files for bankruptcy, the landlord doesn't even have to chase an indemnity agreement. They just turn around and demand the full monthly rent check from the remaining co-tenant.
That's right. It is joint and several liability. But speaking of indemnification, there is also this fascinating hidden layer of agency law indemnification that governs the real estate professionals putting these deals together. It is an intricate web of mutual protection between the brokerage and the client.
Yes, the chain of liability behind the scenes. Under agency law, the principal, which is the client buying or leasing the property, must legally indemnify the agent, meaning the client has to protect the brokerage and its salespeople against losses, liabilities, and expenses that arise while the agent is doing their job.
But there is a massive, highly specific condition attached to that protection.
Yeah.
The client only has to indemnify the brokerage provided that the agent acted in a lawful manner and strictly within the authority granted to them.
Right. So if the agent goes rogue,
Yeah.
if they act unlawfully, if they're negligent, or if they breach their fiduciary duty by, say, making false representations about the property's zoning or failing to carry out their duties diligently, that duty to indemnify completely vanishes. The brokerage is left exposed.
And it flows in the other direction as well. The brokerage must indemnify the client for any acts undertaken personally or delegated to the salespeople. If the client gets sued by a third party because the real estate agent made a critical error or misrepresented a fact, the client can recover those damages directly from the agent and the brokerage.
It is a system designed to ensure that everyone is protecting everyone else, right up until the exact moment someone breaks the rules or acts negligently.
Which happens more than you'd think.
And speaking of breaking the rules, this brings us to what might be the most intense part of this entire deep dive. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about lockouts and the non-payment of rent.
The brutal part of commercial leasing.
It is, because I think most people's frame of reference is residential renting. If you rent an apartment and you hit hard times and miss a payment, the eviction process can take months.
Oh, yeah.
It involves specialized landlord-tenant tribunals, hearings, mediation, and a lot of waiting. But under the Commercial Tenancies Act, the reality is a completely different ballgame, isn't it?
It is a fundamentally different landscape. Residential law is heavily weighted toward protecting the tenant's right to housing. Commercial law is B2B, business to business. It assumes two sophisticated parties entered into a contract for profit.
So the kid gloves are off.
Entirely.
Yeah.
Therefore, the remedies for a landlord are incredibly swift and, frankly, brutal. The key metric that every commercial tenant and landlord needs to memorize is the 16th day rule.
I was reading this and I had to read it twice. Walk us through exactly what happens on that 16th day.
Under the Commercial Tenancies Act, if a commercial tenant does not pay their rent on the due date, let's say rent is due on the 1st of the month, the landlord simply waits. On the 16th day after the rent was due, if payment hasn't been made, the landlord has the legal right to completely change the locks on the commercial unit and evict the tenant. Period.
Just like that. Do they have to serve them papers or warn them first?
No. They can do this entirely without notifying the tenant beforehand. A business owner could literally show up to open their store on the morning of the 16th, coffee in hand, ready to unlock the front door of their boutique in the mall and find that their key no longer works.
That is staggering.
The locks are changed, and there is a notice on the door stating the lease has been terminated for non-payment.
But what about all the stuff inside? If I run a high-end clothing store, I might have hundreds of thousands of dollars of inventory sitting behind that locked door. Can the landlord just keep it?
This is where the law gets highly procedural. The landlord must allow reasonable access for the tenant to eventually remove their property. However, the landlord also has a powerful tool called distress or distraint.
Distraint.
Right. They have the right to seize the tenant's property and inventory located within the premises to cover the unpaid rent.
So they can sell my inventory to pay themselves back, but they can't just seize it and immediately sell it on eBay, right?
No. There are strict formal rules governing that seizure and sale. First, the landlord must hold the seized property for a mandatory period of 5 days.
Just sitting there.
Yes. This is basically a grace period to give the tenant one last desperate chance to come up with the money and make payment arrangements. If those 5 days pass and the tenant still hasn't paid, the landlord can proceed to sell the assets. But as you said, they can't just sell everything for pennies on the dollar to a friend.
Right.
They are legally required to obtain at least 2 independent appraisals to establish a credible, fair market value for the tenant's property.
Because they have a duty to try and get a fair price.
Exactly. And if they do sell the inventory and the equipment, and the proceeds from that sale actually exceed the amount of rent owed, the landlord cannot keep the profit. They have to deduct the rent arrears, deduct the costs of the appraisals and the sale, and then return any excess amount directly to the evicted tenant.
Wow. Now, one detail in the legal framework that stood out to me was a specific protection for subtenants in this scenario. If the main tenant, the person who signed the lease with the landlord, stops paying rent, but there is a smaller subtenant operating out of back office in that same space, the landlord cannot seize the subtenant's property.
That is a crucial caveat. Property belonging to a legitimate subtenant cannot be seized or sold by the head landlord to cover the head tenant's rent default.
Which is fair.
It's totally fair. The law recognizes that the subtenant might be paying their subrent perfectly on time to the head tenant, and it wouldn't be equitable to liquidate their assets just because the middleman failed to pass the money up the chain.
It's such an intense environment, and all of this heavy regulation around non-payment naturally leads us to look at how that payment is actually calculated in the first place. Because the complex math of commercial rent goes far beyond just handing over a single monthly check. It is a highly engineered financial structure.
It absolutely is. When you look at a commercial lease, the rent structure is almost never just one flat number. First of all, the document has to clearly distinguish between base rent and additional rent.
Right.
Base rent is your minimum standard payment for the physical space itself. It is usually calculated on a price per square foot basis annually. Additional rent, however, is where the complexity lies.
The hidden costs.
Exactly. This includes the tenant's proportionate share of the landlord's operating expenses, property taxes, and insurance. And to top it all off, every single dollar of this, both base and additional, is subject to harmonized sales tax, or HST.
Which brings us to the fundamental divide in commercial leasing,
Mm.
the net lease versus the gross lease. Looking at the motivations here, it is obvious why landlords overwhelmingly prefer net leases.
They strongly prefer them because a net lease shifts the unpredictability of property ownership away from the landlord and onto the tenant.
All right.
In a net lease, which can be classified as net, double net, or triple net, depending on exactly which categories of expenses are passed through, the landlord's unexpected costs become the tenant's problem.
So if the municipality suddenly hikes the property taxes by 15%, or if a massive winter storm causes huge unexpected repair bills for the building's roof, those costs are passed directly onto the tenants in the form of increased additional rent.
They are. Whereas in a gross lease, the landlord is the one eating those surprise costs. In a gross lease, the tenant pays one flat, predictable fee every month. If the property taxes double, or the HVAC system explodes and costs a fortune to replace, the tenant's rent stays exactly the same. That is the landlord's problem.
It is easy to see why a business owner would love a gross lease for budgeting purposes, but landlords despise the unpredictability.
Which is why the vast majority of commercial spaces, particularly retail and office plazas, utilize net leases featuring CAM clauses. CAM stands for Common Area Maintenance.
Can
This is a massive category of additional rent. It covers all charges related to repairing, maintaining, operating, supervising, and administering the common areas of the property.
So we're talking about the sweeping of the parking lot, the landscaping, the snow removal, the electricity for the massive signs by the highway, the cleaning of the shared lobby bathrooms, the maintenance of the elevators.
Everything. The landlord adds up every single receipt for all of those services over the course of the year, calculates each tenant's proportionate share based on how much square footage they occupy, and bills it to them as additional rent.
Now, while landlords are very aggressive about passing these costs along, the guidelines do note that they sometimes offer concessions and perks to entice a tenant to sign the lease in the first place.
Right, because they need the building occupied.
Exactly. Especially if we're talking about a brand new development where the units are essentially just concrete boxes, you will often see a rent-free period, which is also known as early occupancy.
Yes. The landlord allows the tenant to take physical possession of the premises before the official start date of the lease. This gives the tenant time to bring in contractors to build out their store, to put up the drywall, install the custom lighting, build the cash wrap, and stock the shelves without having to pay rent while the store is closed to the public.
But there is a huge catch here that a lot of first-time business owners miss. When you see a giant banner offering 3 months rent-free, it almost always means base rent-free.
The fine print.
Yes. Landlords usually stipulate that the additional rent, those CAM charges and property taxes, is still fully payable by the tenant during this early occupancy build-out period.
Furthermore, the tenant can't just walk in and start swinging hammers. The landlord will require that the tenant has fully signed the formal lease, paid the required security deposits, provided all necessary commercial liability insurance certificates.
So all the paperwork has to be flawless.
And crucially, the landlord's architects must approve all of the tenant's construction drawings before the keys are handed over.
And sometimes the landlord will actually help pay for that construction, right? They might offer a tenant improvement allowance.
Yes, that's common. A landlord might agree to contribute a certain dollar amount per square foot toward the tenant's build-out. They might help pay for the installation of new shipping doors, or upgrading the electrical panel, or putting down commercial-grade carpet.
Nice.
But landlords protect themselves financially with a mechanism called an expense stop,
An expense stop.
Right. It refers to the absolute, hard-capped maximum amount of the landlord's financial contribution for all of these concessions. Once the contractor's bills hit that specific number, every single penny of construction cost after that is strictly the tenant's responsibility.
Okay, we promised you listeners some complex math, and we have to talk about the retail percentage lease. This is such a cool concept, and the framework we are looking at provided an exact calculation example.
It's a great example.
Walking through it really highlights the strategy behind commercial retail. Let's create a scenario for everyone listening. Imagine you are leasing a retail unit in a busy shopping center. You run a high-end boutique sneaker shop. You are renting a 2,200 square foot unit.
All right. And the lease stipulates that your base minimum rent is $13.50 per square foot per annum. So doing the math, you take your 2,200 square feet, multiply it by that $13.50 rate, and your base minimum rent is $29,700 for the year.
Okay.
That is the absolute minimum you owe the landlord, regardless of whether you sell 1,000 pairs of sneakers or zero.
But because you are in a premium retail mall, the landlord includes a percentage rent clause in your lease. Let's say this specific clause dictates that you, the tenant, must pay 5.5% of your gross annual sales over a certain base minimum.
Exactly. So the first step is we have to calculate what that artificial breakpoint, that base minimum sale threshold actually is.
How to do that?
To do that, we take your base minimum rent of $29,700 and we divide it by that 5.5% figure, which we express as 0.055.
And $29,700 divided by 0.055 equals exactly $540,000.
That $540,000 is your base minimum sale threshold. It is the exact amount of gross sales where 5.5% perfectly equals your base rent.
Right.
What this means in practice is that if your sneaker shop has a slow year and you make less than $540,000 in gross sales, you don't owe the landlord a single dime in percentage rent.
You just pay your standard $29,700 base rent and you are done.
Yep.
But let's say the store does incredibly well. You have a huge year. The gross annual sales for your sneaker shop come in at $700,000.
A great year.
Because that $700,000 exceeds your $540,000 threshold, the percentage rent clause activates. To calculate what is owed to the landlord, we take your total gross sales of $700,000 and multiply it by the 5.5% rate. That gives us $38,500. This $38,500 is the total rent payable for the entire year.
And since you, as the tenant, have already been writing monthly checks to cover your base minimum rent of $29,700 throughout the year, we simply subtract that from the total.
Right.
So $38,500 minus the $29,700 you already paid equals exactly $8,800. That $8,800 is the extra percentage rent check you have to write to the landlord at the end of the year.
Which is fascinating mathematically, but the strategic insight here is what's really interesting. Why do landlords do this? It's not just about greed or wanting to share in a tenant's profits.
No, not at all. It's a highly strategic management tool. A percentage lease legally requires the retail tenant to report their gross monthly sales figures directly to the landlord. Furthermore, it explicitly grants the landlord the right to audit the tenant's financial books to ensure those sales figures are accurate.
Which fundamentally changes the dynamic. The landlord isn't just a guy collecting rent. They become a sort of silent profit-sharing partner who is looking over your shoulder.
Exactly. And this data is invaluable to a mall operator. It allows the landlord to evaluate the success or failure of individual tenants in real time. But crucially, it also allows the landlord to evaluate the effectiveness of their own massive advertising and promotional activities for the shopping center.
Oh.
Yes, if the mall management spends a fortune on a massive holiday advertising campaign, they can look at the percentage rent figures across all their retail tenants to see if that campaign actually drove measurable foot traffic and sales. It is a built-in hard data performance metric for the entire property.
That level of surveillance into a tenant's business is wild, but it makes total sense from the landlord's perspective. And retail leases have some other incredibly specific quirks that are driven entirely by foot traffic. One of the most fascinating issues I saw in the framework is the dark space problem. I had never really thought about this before, but it is a landlord's worst nightmare.
It is a profound vulnerability in commercial real estate. Most well-drafted retail leases include a continuous use clause. This requires the tenant to actively and continuously occupy the space, to maintain a substantial stock of inventory, and to keep the business fully staffed and open during standard mall hours.
You can't just randomly close on Tuesdays.
Right. If a lease lacks this clause, a landlord might face a dark space scenario.
So paint a picture for us of what a dark space scenario actually looks like.
Imagine a massive anchor tenant, like a huge multi-level department store at the end of a mall wing. For whatever corporate reason, maybe they're consolidating operations or facing national bankruptcy restructuring, they decide to physically vacate that specific store.
Hmm.
They pull out all the inventory, lock the glass doors, and turn off the lights.
Okay.
This space just sits there, completely dark and empty. However, because they're bound by a long-term lease, the corporation continues to perfectly pay their massive rent check every single month.
And from an outside perspective, you might think, well, the landlord is still getting their money. What's the problem?
Yeah.
But the problem is the ecosystem.
Yes.
An anchor tenant is given favorable rent rates precisely because they're supposed to draw thousands of people into the complex. If that huge department store goes dark, no one walks down that wing of the mall anymore. The foot traffic completely dies.
Exactly. The smaller independent retail tenants who rely on that spillover foot traffic begin to suffer immediately. Their sales plummet. Furthermore, other prospective tenants touring the mall will see a massive, dark, abandoned anchor space and immediately decide not to lease there, assuming the mall is dying.
It's a domino effect.
It puts the landlord in a terrible situation, causing a cascading failure across the property, even while the rent check from the dark space continues to clear every month.
Which is why landlords heavily utilize restrictive use clauses alongside those continuous use clauses. It is entirely about curating the ecosystem.
Yes. A restrictive use clause explicitly limits the activities of the tenant, determining exactly which products or services they are permitted to offer. The landlord's goal is to ensure a balanced, profitable tenant mix in the shopping center.
You don't want to lease to 5 different coffee shops and 0 shoe stores. They will just cannibalize each other's sales, and eventually, several will default on their rent.
Exactly, and landlords can go a step further with exclusive use clauses.
Right. A landlord might grant an exclusive use right to a highly desirable tenant. For example, if a major national bank agrees to lease a large pad on the property, the landlord might grant them an exclusive right to provide financial services.
Yes. This means the landlord must go into the restrictive use clauses of all other current and future tenants and explicitly forbid them from operating a banking service or putting ATMs in their windows. It guarantees the bank a monopoly within that specific micromarket.
Now, if we move away from retail and look at office and industrial spaces, the legal quirks change completely. You aren't worried about foot traffic or exclusive monopolies anymore. In office leases, the major stipulations revolve around accessibility and signage.
Correct. Office spaces have very high occupancy loads, so the leases focus heavily on ensuring strict compliance with the Ontario Building Code for acceptable exits, fire suppression systems, and safety standards. And signage is a massive point of negotiation.
Everybody wants their name on the building.
Naturally, office tenants usually want their corporate name on the directory, on their door, and sometimes on the exterior of the building. The lease will dictate that the tenant must get architectural approval for their signs and that the tenant is completely responsible for the cost of installation, maintenance, repair, and crucially, the removal and restoration of the wall after the lease expires.
And then we move to industrial properties, where the primary concern shifts dramatically to the environment.
Oh, industrial real estate is heavily monitored because the risk of permanent catastrophic damage to the land is so high.
Right.
Industrial tenants must conform strictly to the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Environmental Protection Act. The commercial lease will contain extremely dense environmental covenants because industrial tenants absolutely cannot contaminate their leased spaces with chemicals, heavy metals, or perform manufacturing processes that result in unpermitted harmful emissions.
And a landlord can't just cross their fingers and take the tenant's word that they aren't dumping chemicals down the floor drains. They require proof.
Exactly. The tenant is almost always required to commission an environmental site assessment or an ESA conducted by a third-party engineering firm before the lease begins.
To establish a baseline.
This establishes a baseline of the property's clean condition. Then, they are required to pay for another ESA after the lease ends to scientifically prove they didn't leave any toxic surprises behind in the soil or groundwater.
Another fascinating distinction that applies across all these commercial spaces, retail, office, and industrial, is the concept of fixtures versus trade fixtures. I think everyone has wondered about this. If I rent a commercial space and I pay a contractor to bolt something heavy to the wall, who owns it when my lease is up and I want to leave?
It is a very common dispute. The general legal rule is that any regular fixture, which is defined as an item securely attached to the property by either the landlord or the tenant, legally becomes the property of the landlord upon the expiry of the lease.
So if you bolt custom architectural lighting into the ceiling grid, it stays with the building. But there is a massive exception for business owners, which is the trade fixture. Basically, if you bolt it to the landlord's wall, it's the landlord's property now unless it's a trade fixture.
Right. Unless the lease specifically restricts it, a tenant is legally permitted to remove trade fixtures at the end of the lease term. A trade fixture is strictly defined as an item installed specifically for the purpose of carrying out the tenant's trade or business.
So, an easy analogy for you listeners, if you run a commercial bakery, you can take your massive specialized pizza ovens when you leave, even if they were bolted to the floor and wired directly into the electrical panel.
Yes, you can take the ovens, but there are strict conditions. First, the tenant must have fulfilled all rental obligations. You can't be in arrears on your rent and start unbolting ovens.
Fair enough.
Second, the law and the lease stipulate that the tenant is entirely responsible for repairing any damage to the leased premises caused by the removal of those trade fixtures. You can take your massive bakery oven, but if you smash a hole in the landlord's drywall getting it out the door, or if you leave exposed high-voltage wiring, you are legally obligated to pay contractors to fix the wall and safe off the electrical.
That makes perfect sense. Now, before we leave the topic of commercial leases entirely, we have to talk about what happens if a tenant wants out early. Life happens, businesses change, and sometimes you need to break a 5-year lease in year 2. This brings up the concepts of assignment versus subletting.
What's fascinating here is the underlying legal concept of privity. Understanding privity is the only way to truly understand the fundamental difference between an assignment and a sublease.
I keep seeing this word privity in the legal guidelines. What exactly is privity?
Think of privity as an invisible legal tether that connects two parties. The doctrine of privity of contract dictates that only the parties directly involved in a contract are bound by it, and only they can enforce the rights and obligations under that contract. If you and I sign a contract, we have privity. A random third person walking down the street has no privity with either of us regarding that contract.
Okay, let's break down how that invisible tether works in an assignment of lease.
In an assignment, the original tenant, who is called the assignor, transfers their entire remaining interest in the lease over to a new tenant, the assignee. The new tenant essentially steps into the shoes of the old tenant. The assignee assumes the obligations to pay rent and maintain the space.
Right.
But here is the catch. Initially, the new tenant has no direct privity of contract with the landlord. The original tether is still between the landlord and the original tenant.
So the critical detail here is that the original tenant might actually retain their privity, their legal liability with the landlord, even though they don't occupy the space anymore.
Precisely. Unless the landlord explicitly agrees in writing to completely release the original tenant from the lease, that original tenant remains on the hook. You'd assign your lease to a new business owner, hand over the keys, walk away, and 2 years later, if that new guy stops paying rent, the landlord can and will come after you for the money. Your invisible tether was never cut.
Contrast that risk with subletting. How does the tether work there?
In a sublet scenario, the original tenant retains their lease but rents out a portion or all of the space to a subtenant for a period that is shorter than the main lease term. In this structure, there is absolutely no privity of contract between the main landlord and the subtenant.
Zero.
Zero. They do not know each other legally. The landlord's tether is to the main tenant. The main tenant has a separate tether to the subtenant.
Which seems like a huge risk for the head landlord. They have a stranger operating in their building who they have no legal contract with.
It is a massive risk. Because of this lack of privity, most commercial landlords will insist on a specific provision in the head lease, requiring any future subtenant to sign an agreement directly covenanting with the landlord.
Building a bridge.
Effectively building a legal bridge, establishing a direct line of privity so the landlord has the legal authority to pursue action against either the main tenant or the subtenant if the rules are broken.
And from a strict paperwork standpoint, a commercial sublease uses an entirely different set of documents, typically an OREA Form 515, which is an agreement to sublease. It looks a lot like a standard lease agreement, detailing the names of the sublandlord, the original tenant, and the subtenant. But crucially, a complete copy of the head lease, the master document signed with the main landlord, must be attached as a schedule to the sublease agreement. Every single thing the subtenant does still has to strictly comply with the rules of that master document.
We have spent a lot of time discussing the liability of the buildings themselves and the businesses that occupy them. But the legal gamble actually starts years before the concrete is even poured. If we shift our focus from the buildings to the raw dirt they sit on, we enter the world of land development.
This is arguably the ultimate real estate gamble.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it all begins with a core Foundational appraisal concept. Highest and best use.
Right, because the value of development land isn't based on what it is right now, it is based on its highest and best use in the future. If you are looking at an empty, overgrown lot in the middle of a city, the appraiser isn't valuing it as a weed farm, they have to determine what could theoretically be built there.
Exactly.
And the framework dictates that the proposed use has to meet three strict criteria. It has to legally conform to zoning bylaws. It has to be physically possible given the size, shape, and soil conditions of the site. And most importantly, there has to be a proven economic demand for it in the marketplace.
And if the site is already improved, meaning it already has older buildings sitting on it, the appraiser first looks at whether that current use still conforms to zoning. And if the aging building actually adds any value to the land, very often in rapidly growing cities, it doesn't.
The dirt is worth more than the structure.
The appraiser will look for an alternative use, which usually involves tearing the building down. This brings us to a highly strategic maneuver that developers use to exponentially increase value: land assembly or assemblage.
I love this concept. Let's visualize it for the listeners. How does assemblage actually create value out of thin air?
Think of it like buying two adjacent corner pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Individually, they're just small pieces of cardboard. You can't see the big picture. But if you manage to acquire both of them and snap them together, they suddenly give you the framework for an entirely new section of the puzzle. Developers call this process assemblage, the merging of two or more abutting parcels of land into single ownership for the purpose of creating greater utility.
So if you have two small, separate, aging commercial lots side by side on a busy street, they might be worth $1 million each because you can only fit a small diner on them. But if a developer buys both of them and combines the title, that new single massive site isn't just worth $2 million.
Exactly. Because now, with the combined square footage, the zoning might allow you to build a 20-story residential condo tower with underground parking. The utility of the single massive site is exponentially greater than the individual sites combined. 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2 in assemblage, 1 plus 1 equals 5. The legal and physical merging process itself creates a massive, immediate increase in intrinsic value.
To achieve this, developers have a very specific shopping list of property types they are hunting for. They look at raw and vacant lands on the edge of town, which are usually cheaper because they completely lack municipal services like water and sewer lines. They look at small, unoccupied properties up to 5 acres, where the existing buildings are cheap enough to simply bulldoze. They look at massive parcels over 5 acres that are ready to be carved up into sprawling new residential subdivisions. They even target operational farmland that happens to sit adjacent to existing, expanding urban boundaries.
And one of the most interesting and risky targets on a developer's shopping list: brownfields.
What exactly is a brownfield?
Brownfields are commercial or industrial sites located right in the heart of urban areas. They are highly desirable because all the municipal infrastructure, the roads, the high-capacity sewers, the transit lines is already perfectly in place. But they have a massive catch.
Contamination.
Because of their previous industrial use, maybe it was an old gas station, a dry cleaner, or a manufacturing plant, the soil and groundwater are often heavily polluted or contaminated.
Taking on a brownfield, or frankly, any of these massive development properties, involves a staggering amount of risk for an investor. The guidelines define risk in real estate as being based on fluctuations in the income stream and the project's vulnerability to external influences. The framework breaks these down into 4 distinct categories.
Yes, the risk matrix. First, there are financial risks. These are macroeconomic factors outside the developer's control, like suddenly fluctuating interest rates that make construction loans impossibly expensive, or inflation destroying the purchasing power of the future dollars they hope to earn.
Second, there are market risks, which are directly tied to local supply and demand, occupancy rates, and future vacancy projections.
Third, there are business risks, which encompass sudden changes in taxation policy or periods of slow, stagnant economic activity where no one is buying new houses. And finally, building risks, which include physical calamities on the construction site, the natural depreciation of materials, and sudden, costly changes to municipal building code restrictions right in the middle of a project.
Navigating all those interrelated risks means dealing with mountains of bureaucratic red tape. In Ontario, for example, massive land development is heavily guided by provincial legislation like the Places to Grow Act. This act provides highly detailed, long-term strategies for identified growth areas. The government is essentially drawing circles on a map, focusing development on areas targeted for tourism, employment hubs, and economic growth. The act aggressively promotes greater housing density and integration with mass transportation options. Real estate salespersons working with major developers have to intimately understand these complex provincial criteria to find the right parcels of land.
Then, layered underneath that provincial strategy, there is the Planning Act, which defines the strict scope of municipal regulatory requirements. If a developer buys a plot of land and wants to change its legal use, say, taking a massive plot of agricultural land and attempting to rezone it to high-density residential, it triggers a massive, legally mandated process of consultation with municipal planners and the general public.
And that public consultation is where many projects die. If the neighboring property owners strongly object to the increased traffic, or if the development plan is simply rejected by the local municipal council for political reasons, the developer's main recourse is to escalate the fight. They have to make an expensive, time-consuming appeal to the local Planning Appeals Tribunal, or LPAT, for an independent legal review.
Assuming a developer actually survives the zoning battles and gets their approvals, the initial site selection process itself is an absolute minefield. Buyers aren't just looking at the price per acre. They are analyzing soil bearing capacity, environmental factors, topography, and the strict availability of municipal water, sewage capacity, and high voltage electricity. But beyond the physical dirt, they have to do incredibly deep title searches to understand what invisible legal strings are attached to the land. They are specifically hunting for restrictive covenants and easements.
These are critical legal concepts. A restrictive covenant is essentially a permanent rule placed on the title by a previous owner that legally binds all subsequent owners. It restricts exactly how the land can be used forever. For example, a previous owner might have placed a restrictive covenant stating that no structure taller than 2 stories can ever be built on the lot to preserve a neighbor's view. If a developer buys that lot intending to build a high-rise without checking the title first, their entire multi-million-dollar business model is instantly dead.
Easements are just as dangerous, right? An easement is a legally registered right enjoyed by one landowner or a utility company over the land of another. Because an easement is registered directly on the title and automatically transfers to all subsequent owners, it might severely limit or completely restrict the proposed use of the land by the new developer. Imagine a developer spending $5 million to buy a prime commercial lot, only to discover during the architectural phase that a regional utility company has a permanent unmovable easement for a massive underground gas main running diagonally right through the exact center of their proposed foundation footprint. You cannot build a foundation over a high-pressure gas main. The land becomes virtually unbuildable for their intended purpose.
Which highlights exactly why due diligence is so absolutely paramount in this industry. For the real estate salesperson brokering these massive land deals, they have a heavy legal obligation to gather and verify information, but specifically, they have a strict duty to disclose material facts.
A material fact is any fact or detrimental condition that would reasonably affect a buyer's decision to purchase the property or the price they are willing to pay. And crucially, a salesperson must disclose latent defects, which are hidden defects that cannot be discovered by a reasonable visual inspection at the absolute earliest practical opportunity.
In the context of raw land development, a latent defect is almost never a leaky roof. It is almost always related to severe environmental issues, like hidden underground aquifers or toxic water and soil contamination from decades ago.
Because the complexity and the liability are so astronomically high, a real estate salesperson should never be guessing or offering their own uneducated opinions on these matters. They are professionally obligated to encourage the buyer to seek third-party professional advice. Developing raw land requires an absolute army of highly specialized experts.
I was looking at the list of experts required in our guidelines, and it really paints a narrative of the nightmare scenarios developers are trying to avoid. Let's walk through this. A developer buys a massive plot of land on the edge of a growing city. They want to build 1,000 homes. First, they find out there is a hidden underground stream network. Enter the hydrogeological engineer.
Right. The hydrogeological engineers are brought in to map the underground water flow, to confirm if there is sufficient safe sewage capacity, and to design massive community or private septic systems that won't contaminate the local water table.
Then the developer realizes that paving over 1,000 acres of natural fields means the rainwater has nowhere to soak into the ground. If it rains heavily, the new subdivision will instantly flood the neighboring town. Enter the stormwater management experts.
These engineers use complex fluid dynamics to create massive, engineered retention ponds and drainage plans that capture, hold, and slowly release millions of gallons of rainwater, legally protecting the development from downstream flooding lawsuits.
Then they realize the back edge of the new subdivision borders a busy 8-lane provincial highway. The roar of transport trucks is deafening. Enter the acoustics experts.
The acoustics experts conduct prolonged, scientifically calibrated noise studies. They then recommend highly specific architectural mitigation methods like massive earthen berms, specialized sound-deflecting fencing, or upgraded window glazing requirements to legally reduce the industrial noise levels to acceptable provincial standards for the future residents.
And finally, they have to convince the city council that this massive new development won't just be an ugly grid of asphalt. Enter the urban designers.
The urban designers are the visionaries who create the master plan. They design the pedestrian-friendly streetscapes, plan the turning circles for fire trucks and garbage collection, seamlessly integrate parklands, and map out sprawling trail systems that connect the new community to existing municipal infrastructure. It is a staggering multi-million-dollar logistical and scientific undertaking before a single excavator even arrives on the site to start moving dirt.
That level of complexity is incredible. And while developers are out there fighting zoning battles and orchestrating armies of engineers to turn raw land into subdivisions, there is an entirely different, equally complex, multi-million-dollar industry operating on the rural land right next door. I want to shift our focus to the business of farming, because the agricultural landscape we see driving down the highway is changing rapidly behind the scenes.
It truly is. The traditional romanticized concept of the small, independent family farm is in a steep, long-term decline. Domestic and international market competition is tougher and more ruthless than ever. What we are seeing across the agricultural sector is a massive structural trend toward the farm corporation. This corporate shift is being driven by several harsh, unavoidable economic realities.
Let's break those realities down. First, you have rapidly rising farm labor costs. Finding people willing to do grueling physical labor for long hours is incredibly difficult and expensive. Then you have the macro pressure of fluctuating global food prices, which demand extreme efficiency to maintain any profit margin.
And that drive for efficiency requires scale. It requires larger and larger capital investments in heavily mechanized, computer-guided equipment combines and tractors that cost upwards of $1 million each. To justify and get a reasonable return on that massive capital investment, farms have to consolidate and grow larger. Furthermore, standardizing into a corporate structure provides much better availability of massive financing from institutional lenders.
It's important to define what we are actually talking about when we say farming in a legal sense. Under federal statute, farming is a broad umbrella that covers a wide array of commercial activities. It's obviously the production of field-grown crops like wheat and corn. It includes cultivated and horticultural crops in massive greenhouse complexes. It covers the raising of livestock, poultry, and fur-bearing animals. But legally, it also includes producing eggs, milk, honey, maple syrup, tobacco, fiber, and even harvesting wood from managed woodlots.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, there is a hidden layer of value in certain agricultural sectors that dwarfs the value of the land itself. In highly regulated sectors like dairy or poultry, the actual dirt, the massive barns, and the animals themselves might not be the most valuable part of the farm operation. Farm quotas are the real golden ticket.
I had always heard the term quota, but I didn't realize how absolute it was until I read the framework. A high-producing dairy farm with millions of dollars in state-of-the-art robotic milking equipment, hundreds of acres of prime pasture, and a massive herd of healthy cows may have virtually zero operational value if a farm quota is not legally assigned to it.
That is correct. Quotas affect the value of specific farm properties immensely. You cannot simply buy a farm, buy some cows, and start selling milk to the grocery store. The supply chain is fiercely protected and heavily regulated. Our guidelines outline that there are 3 different types of marketing boards governing these agricultural sectors.
Right. At the lowest level of intervention, you have negotiating boards. They don't limit production. They simply act as a collective bargaining unit to negotiate the minimum base price paid to all producers for a crop. Then, a step up, you have boards with authority to establish price. They legally set the exact price the market must pay, but again, they don't explicitly limit how much a farmer is allowed to produce.
But the heavy hitters, the organizations that truly control the wealth in these sectors, are the boards regulating production and/or marketing, using quotas. These boards operate as strict cartels. They use a quota system to dictate exactly what and precisely how much each specific farmer is legally allowed to produce and sell into the market. A quota is literally a license to produce. If you don't own the quota, no processor is legally allowed to buy your milk or your chickens. Because the supply of quota is artificially limited by the board to keep prices stable, the market value of the quota itself skyrockets, often becoming the single most expensive asset on the farm's balance sheet.
Because the capital required to buy the massive acreage, the million-dollar equipment, and the multi-million-dollar quota is so astronomically high, farm leasing has become an incredibly common business model.
It is the only way many younger farmers can enter the industry. In a farm lease scenario, the landlord, who is often a retired farmer or a corporate investor, provides the raw land, the massive storage facilities and silos, and pays the annual municipal property taxes. The tenant farmer, who acts as the operator, is responsible for providing all the seed, fertilizer, labor, and the heavy machinery required to actually work the land.
And how they negotiate the split of the final profits takes a few different, highly specific forms. The most common division of income is the crop share lease. In this structure, typically a straight one-third share of all revenue from the final crop sales goes directly to the landlord as rent, and the tenant keeps the remaining two-thirds to cover their operational costs and profit.
Then there is the cash rent lease, which looks more like a traditional commercial lease. The tenant pays a fixed, guaranteed dollar amount per acre to the landlord up front. In exchange, the tenant keeps 100% of the income from the crop sales. This shifts all the risk of a bad harvest or a drop in global grain prices entirely onto the tenant.
And finally, there is the flexible cash lease, which tries to balance that risk. In a flexible lease, the rent the tenant pays isn't a fixed number. It violently fluctuates depending on the actual market price of the grain at harvest time or the actual bushel yield of the crop harvested from those specific fields.
Now, if a corporate entity or an individual is actually buying a farm rather than leasing it, you have to follow the massive amounts of money involved. That means deeply understanding agricultural taxes and financing. Federally, farmers rely heavily on specialized lenders, primarily the Farm Credit Corporation, or FCC. The FCC is a massive federal crown corporation that provides mortgages, loans, and financial services specifically tailored to the unique cash flow cycles of agriculture loans for buying land, financing combines, acquiring livestock, and constructing massive barns.
But the provincial tax breaks are where the math gets truly wild. In Ontario, for example, farmers receive an absolutely massive 75% tax reduction for their municipal property taxes, provided their property is officially assessed as farmland. A 75% discount on taxes for hundreds of acres of land is a staggering financial advantage.
It is the difference between profitability and bankruptcy for most farms. But the government doesn't just hand that discount out automatically to anyone who buys a tractor. You have to continually meet strict ongoing criteria. You must prove you are actively continuing a legitimate farming business. You must be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. You must maintain a valid farm registration number, and you have to proactively submit a detailed application annually to prove compliance.
And here is a phenomenal, incredibly dangerous detail from the legal guidelines regarding the timing of a farm sale. It's the kind of obscure trap that can cost a buyer tens of thousands of dollars if their real estate agent isn't paying attention. If the sale of working farm closes after September 1st of the calendar year, the buyer might actually lose that 75% reduced tax rate for the remainder of the year.
That is a critical administrative trap. Because of how the assessment rolls are processed, a late-year title transfer can trigger an automatic municipal reassessment. The municipality will suddenly bill the new buyer for the balance of the current year at the full 100% residential or commercial non-discounted rate.
That tax bill could be thousands and thousands of dollars higher than expected. And if that unexpected reassessment happens, the buyer is on a very tight ticking clock. They only have until October 31st to formally submit a request for reconsideration, an RFR, to the administrator of the farmland class to try and legally prove they are a farmer and get that 75% discount reinstated. That is exactly the kind of high-stakes deadline that a rural real estate agent needs to be hyper-aware of.
Also, regarding the massive tax implications of these multi-million-dollar deals, the application of harmonized sales tax, or HST, is a major factor. Generally, commercial real estate sales are subject to HST. However, personal use farmland may be entirely exempt from HST if it is sold to a related individual like a parent selling the family farm to a child who will definitively continue its use in the farming business.
The extreme complexity of these agricultural transactions really becomes apparent when we look at the specific, highly customized clauses used in the legal agreements. Let's examine the quirks and protections involved in buying a farm. Because if you read an agreement of purchase and sale for a farm, the clauses look totally alien compared to buying a suburban house.
They absolutely do. They reflect the reality that a farm is a complex, living, breathing, heavily regulated biological factory.
Here are some of my absolute favorites from the text. First, the inspection of bush acreage. Let's say you are buying a 100-acre property and 20 acres of it is a dense private woodlot. You might assume that because you own the land, you can just go out there with a chainsaw and start clear cutting the trees to plant more corn, but you can't.
No, you cannot. Environmental and municipal regulations heavily protect mature woodlands. You often need a specific municipal permit to cut down any tree once its trunk reaches a certain diameter. Now, permits generally aren't required to remove dead, diseased, or hazardous trees that pose a risk, but to harvest healthy timber, you need formal permission. Therefore, smart buyers will insert specific clauses into the purchase agreement, making the entire multi-million-dollar deal conditional upon receiving a satisfactory inspection report from a certified arborist. Furthermore, keeping that private woodlot healthy and actively managed according to a professional forestry plan is legally required to qualify for significantly lower property taxes under programs like the Managed Forest Tax Incentive Program.
Another highly specific, invisible clause relates to the Tile Drainage Act. Most people don't know this, but farmers install incredibly complex GPS-guided networks of perforated underground plastic pipes across their fields to actively drain excess rainwater away from the crop roots. It costs a fortune.
It does. And to pay for it, the seller of the farm may have received a specialized low-interest municipal loan under the Tile Drainage Act. That loan is tied directly to the property taxes. The real estate agreement must explicitly address this hidden debt, legally determining whether the buyer is assuming the remaining balance of that municipal loan or if the seller is required to pay it off entirely out of the proceeds of the sale before closing.
And then there's the fascinating question of biological ownership. If I buy a 500-acre farm today, and the title officially transfers to my name, but there is a massive field full of corn that the seller planted 5 months ago. Who gets the corn? I own the dirt, but they bought the seed.
That exact scenario is addressed by an ancient legal concept known as a profit apprendre. Because crops take months to grow and give yield long after they are planted, a highly specific clause must be inserted in the purchase agreement to separate the ownership of the dirt from the ownership of the plants. This clause legally ensures the seller retains the continued right to harvest the existing crop even after the sale is closed and the buyer holds the deed to the land. The seller retains a registered legal right to cross the property line, bring their massive combines onto the new owner's land, harvest the profit from the fields, and leave.
There are also heavy environmental considerations that mirror what we talked about with industrial commercial leases. Environmental site assessments, ESAs, apply out here too. You might need a strict ESA condition in the contract to address a scenario where the seller has 5 old, rusty, leaking tractors parked out behind a dilapidated barn, slowly dripping hydraulic fluid and motor oil into the ground for decades, causing a massive plume of soil contamination.
Or clauses demanding intense inspections of the agricultural infrastructure, ensuring the massive commercial water pumps are working properly and have the legally mandated flow capacity to sustain a thirsty dairy herd of 300 cows.
With all this complexity and potential for environmental liability, there is also a fascinating layer of legal protection that exists strictly to shield the farmer against the outside world. This is the Farming and Food Production Protection Act, or the FFPPA.
This is one of the most powerful pieces of legislation protecting the agricultural industry in Ontario.
I find this piece of legislation so interesting because of the social dynamic it addresses. It essentially protects farmers from nuisance complaints. Let's create a scenario. You get a wealthy family from the city who decides they want the romantic, peaceful country lifestyle. They buy a severed residential lot right next to a massive operational dairy farm. And then summer hits, and they suddenly realize that farms smell overwhelmingly like manure, that massive diesel tractors run at 5 a.m., and that hundreds of cows are incredibly loud. So they call their lawyers, they try to sue the farmer for loss of enjoyment of their property, or they try to get the local municipal council to pass noise and odor bylaws to force the farmer to stop.
Which used to be a massive threat to the agricultural sector, but the FFPPA shuts that down. The Act explicitly states that as long as the farming operations are conducted in a manner consistent with normal farm practice, which is legally defined as proper and acceptable customs and standards established by similar agricultural operations using innovative technology and good management practices, the farmer is completely legally protected from civil nuisance lawsuits regarding odor, noise, and dust.
It is an absolute shield.
It is. If a conflict escalates, it goes before the Farming and Food Production Protection Board. This specialized board has the sweeping authority to outright dismiss frivolous nuisance complaints from angry neighbors. They will only issue an injunction ordering a farmer to cease a specific practice if they mathematically prove that the farmer's actions fall wildly outside the boundaries of normal, acceptable agricultural practice. It essentially shields the multi-billion-dollar agricultural industry from restrictive, localized municipal bylaws that would otherwise legislate them out of existence just to appease angry suburbanites who move to the country.
So what does this all mean when you are actually at the finish line trying to close a massive, complex deal on a farm property and things start to go wrong? Pre-closing drama on a multi-million-dollar farm is wildly different from the drama of a home inspection on a suburban house.
It is entirely tied to the living, breathing assets of the operation: the livestock, the growing crops, and the specialized machinery. The purchase agreement must account for the fact that the farm is a moving target right up until the minute the deal closes. For example, if the buyer is doing their final walkthrough inspection the day before closing and discovers missing equipment, say the seller impulsively decided to take a vital $50,000 robotic feed cart or a high-pressure washing system that was explicitly listed in the contract as an included fixture, the agreement needs a pre-negotiated legal mechanism to handle it.
Right, because you can't just cancel a $10 million land deal over a missing pressure washer, but the buyer shouldn't have to absorb that loss.
Exactly. The agreement will typically contain a condition that absolutely no equipment will be removed prior to closing. If something is missing or broken during the final walkthrough, the lawyers will either formally extend the closing date to give the seller time to physically replace the item, or they will mathematically adjust the final purchase price downwards by the exact appraised value of the missing equipment.
The same strict logic applies to the growing crops. If a freak hailstorm destroys 50 acres of wheat 2 days before closing, the seller should have maintained crop insurance to cover those damages, and the proceeds of that insurance claim are transferred to the buyer, or again, the final purchase price gets heavily adjusted downwards. But the most stressful, high-stakes, pre-closing drama has to involve the animals.
Without question. If you are buying a fully operational quota-holding dairy farm, and suddenly half the herd contracts a severe respiratory disease or hoof infection a week before closing, the entire financial viability of the purchase is threatened. The purchase agreement must be explicitly conditional on the seller continuing prudent, professional farming practices right up to the closing date. If the herd health plummets, the agreement must be legally amended by the lawyers to reflect the exact change in the number of healthy producing animals, often resulting in massive financial holdbacks until the herd recovers.
And leading up to that incredibly stressful closing day, the buyer's lawyer and real estate agent must ensure absolute compliance with massive environmental regulations. We haven't even touched on the Nutrient Management Act, which strictly regulates the storage, handling, and transportation of commercial fertilizers and raw animal manure, requiring detailed, audited records and strict mathematical minimum distance separations between new livestock facilities and local water sources.
And perhaps the most critical pre-closing condition of all: the agent has to ensure rigorous, scientifically certified inspection of the farm's deep water wells and septic systems. They need a formalized bacteriological analysis of the well water conducted by the local public health office to ensure there is absolute zero contamination from E. coli or agricultural runoff. A bad water test on a livestock farm can instantly halt operations, ruin the herd, and kill the entire real estate transaction overnight.
It is an incredible, invisible web of interconnected legal liabilities, strict environmental stewardship, and ruthless financial calculations.
It absolutely is. It is the hidden operating system of the agricultural world.
It really is. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started deep in the concrete jungle, looking at the ruthless realities of 16th-day commercial lockouts, the crucial legal difference between a skeleton agreement to lease and the muscular formal lease, and the intense strategic math behind percentage rent that allows corporate landlords to audit their tenants' books. We looked at how ambitious developers piece together land assembly, snapping adjacent lots together like puzzle pieces to exponentially increase value, while navigating a terrifying minefield of zoning laws, unmovable easements, and environmental assessments. And finally, we explored the hidden economics of the agricultural world, where a piece of paper called a milk quota is worth more than the dirt itself, where you need a municipal permit just to cut down a tree on your own land, and where the law actively, aggressively protects the smell of manure from angry suburban neighbors. I have to say, to you, our listener, thank you for diving into the deep end with us today. These are dense, highly technical and often unforgiving legal frameworks. But because you stuck with it and unpacked this with us, the next time you walk through a busy shopping mall and notice a massive vacant anchor store, or you drive past a massive cornfield on the edge of a growing city, you aren't just going to see brick, glass, and dirt anymore. You are going to see the invisible matrix of commercial leases, proclivity of contract, restrictive covenants, and complex environmental assessments that are actively holding our entire physical world together.
And to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to mull over as you navigate that physical world. Consider how the very concept of owning land is, in many ways, a complete illusion. Between the municipal zoning laws dictating exactly what you are allowed to build, the restrictive covenants controlling how you must use it, the invisible utility easements granting others permanent access across it, the agricultural quotas dictating what you are legally allowed to produce on it, and ancient concepts like profit or prendre legally separating your surface rights from the very plants growing out of the dirt. Property isn't just a static piece of earth that belongs to you. It's merely a temporary, highly regulated, and infinitely complex bundle of invisible legal rights.
What a perfect matrix-breaking way to wrap this up. The dirt is just the canvas. The legal rights are the actual masterpiece. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking beneath the surface of the physical world around you, and we will see you next time.